Hello everybody, I'm Linguaphiliax, and today I'm going to be talking about Australian languages again, because of course I am. They're pretty much a defining feature about my channel right at the moment. One of the many things that makes learning these languages so difficult, especially to those who don't have the same experience with languages like I do, is that a lot of them don't have consistent writing systems. At least not yet. I've already talked about writing systems in my new writing system for English video, which I've now decided to call NewScript, by the way, and will continue to do so whenever I bring it up. And I've also given a general overview as to how the phonologies of Australian languages typically work, and that's phonology, not phonetics, like I kept saying throughout the entire video, and no, I don't have time to explain what the difference is right now, because today I'm going to be bringing the concepts of writing systems and phonology together and talk about some of the Australian languages that do have consistent writing systems and how they are used to represent their language's phonologies. I'm going to be going through this video based on the assumption that all of you watching have seen both those videos already, since I don't want to go around explaining things all over again. Some of the stuff in this video might not make sense if you haven't seen those videos yet, so I definitely recommend watching them first, and you can also maybe give them lots of likes and share them online, leave some comments, subscribe, ring that bell, support my Patreon, etc. This video is pretty much going to follow the same structure as the phonology video, where I'll introduce each group of consonants and vowels bit by bit, explaining how each language transcribes each category, and then I will also be adding a few extra notes and criticisms about some of the things that, based on my knowledge about how these systems work, could either be improved on or should probably be avoided. And hopefully all of the information in this video will be useful to any Indigenous Australians watching who want to develop writing systems for their own language that their mob can readily use. The writing systems I'll be talking about in this video will be for the Gamilaroi, Wiradjuri, Bundjalung, Warlpiri, Pinjachara, Arrernte, Biningunwok, Yolngumatha, Miriwong, and Darumbal languages. Also, since all of these languages are written with the Latin alphabet, I will only be considering things related to the Latin alphabet in this video. If you want to use a different writing system for your language like Kyrillic or Devanagari or, I don't know, Arabic, then this video isn't going to be very helpful for you, sorry. But anyway, let's just jump right into it and start off with the obstruents. Out of all the languages I'll be talking about, every one of them has a bilabial, velar, and alveolar obstruent. In other words, the sounds b, g, and d. I mean, bilabial, alveolar, and velar are like the most commonly used places of articulation worldwide. That's not just an Australian thing. Pretty much every spoken language in the entire world has a series of these consonants. But my point is, we can already sort most of these systems into two distinct categories right off the bat. There are voiced systems, which use B, G, and D for these obstruents, and voiceless systems that use P, K, and T. Gamilaroi, Wiradjuri, Bundjalung, and Miriwong sort of use voiced consonants, and Warlpiri, Pinjachara, and Arrernte use voiceless consonants. This is because, as I mentioned in the phonology video, most Australian languages do not make a voicing contrast like European languages do, which means that Australian languages can pretty much choose whichever variant letter they want to transcribe the sounds. In fact, Biningunwok does something slightly different and uses BKD, and it all works out fine. And yes, there is actually a reason why they do this, but I'll get back to that later. But let's also take a look at Darumbal and Yolngumatha obstruents for a second, because these languages use both voiced and voiceless letters for the obstruents, and there is actually a difference between them. Both Darumbal and Yolngumatha make a distinction between lenis, or soft consonants, written with B, G, and D, and fortis, or hard consonants, written with P, K, and T. But wait, Linguaphiliax, you literally just said that Australian languages don't make a voicing distinction. Yeah, I know. That's why I decided to talk about these languages, because they are some of the rare few that actually do make this distinction, sort of. Well, okay, not really though. Let me explain. The categories of lenis and fortis are distinct from voicing because they each refer to a group of phonetic features that occur together rather than just one of them. That usually does include a voicing distinction, and a language might treat it as if it's the same thing, but it's not really. Typically, lenis refers to consonants that are voiced, shorter, and plain, while fortis refers to consonants that are voiceless, longer, and aspirated. It's kind of like a voicing distinction with extra stuff added onto it. Also, the fortis obstruents for both Darumbal and Yolngumatha cannot go at the beginning of words, so that implies they might actually be a longer or harder variant of the regular Lenis obstruents. In fact, Biningunwok also makes a Lenis fortis distinction in the same environments, but instead of using different symbols, they just double the letters to reinforce the length of the obstruents. So, in summation, strictly speaking, these languages don't actually need to use voiceless letters to represent fortis obstruents, but that's just what they've decided to do. By the way, Miriwong also uses K as well as G in a specific situation, but I'll get back to that later. In fact, the Miriwong writing system has a lot of interesting quirks, so just expect that I'll be coming back to it several times throughout this video. But anyway, while it's fairly easy to transcribe bilabial velar and alveolar consonants with one letter each, since those sounds have basic Latin equivalents, the dental, palatal, and retroflex consonants, however, are most often represented with digraphs, typically based off of whatever the alveolar letter is. For most Australian languages, the dental consonant is written with an H after the alveolar letter, the palatal consonant is written with either J or Y after it, and the retroflex is written with an R before it. For all the languages that have dental consonants, Gamilaroi and Wiradjuri use DH, Aranda and Miriwong use TH, and of course Darumbal and Yolngumatha use both, as I mentioned before. In fact, it's even in their names. Interestingly though, in the case of Miriwong, this means that the dental consonant does not actually match the alveolar obstruent, as the letter D is used for the alveolar, but TH is used for the dental. Moving on, however, the palatal obstruent is a little complicated to explain, and for all the languages here that have it, there are 5 different ways this sound may be written down depending on the language. Gamilaroi and Biningunwok both use DJ, and Wiradjuri uses DY, whereas Binchachara uses TJ and Aranda uses TY. Walburi and Miriwong, however, just use J, which is again another interesting case where it is not based off of the alveolar letter, and Bundjalung uses J at the beginning of words and DJ in the middle of words, meaning Jarjum is written like this. I don't know why Bundjalung does this, I guess it just looks a little better. Yolngumatha, of course, uses both DJ and TJ, and Darumbal doesn't have a palatal series, so it doesn't use any of these letter combinations. Also, just as a tip, if you're wanting to transcribe the palatal consonants for your language, I would advise that the alveolar forms with J are the better option, as opposed to the forms with Y, but I'll get back to why that is later. Also, yes, I know that I've been saying I'll get back to that later a lot throughout this whole video. That's just the way it is. Please bear with me. I promise it will all make sense in the end. Hopefully. And finally, moving on to retroflex consonants, Biningunwok and Miriwong use the digraph RD to represent the retroflex consonant, whereas Walburi and Aranda use RT. But Binchachara and Yolngumatha do something honestly kinda irritating. They use a line below diacritic to represent retroflex articulation. Please excuse me as I go off on a small ranty tangent about this. If any of you are looking to create a writing system for your language using the Latin alphabet, do not use diacritics unless it is absolutely necessary. Or at very least, if you're going to use diacritics, use ones that are A, easy to type, and B, have been encoded in most fonts. In other words, avoid going past Latin 1 supplement. For those of you that don't quite see how this is a problem, let me give you an example. Here is a line of Baker Boy's lyrics again with a lot of retroflex consonants, and it looks perfectly fine in the Calibri font, but let's just go ahead and change the font to, I don't know, Matura MT script capitals and great. Computer says no. Like, even the letter Eng doesn't encode properly. Seriously, just avoid using all sorts of weird symbols. Anyway, what was I up to? Oh right, nasal consonants. Out of all the languages in this video, every one of them, once again, has a bilabial, velar, and alveolar nasal. In other words, the sounds ng, and n. Thankfully, the nasals are a lot easier to explain, as all the languages here transcribe the bilabial with M, the alveolar with N, and the velar nasal with NG, except for Yolngumatha, of course, which uses Eng instead. I already mentioned some of the problems surrounding the letter Eng. It was literally 30 seconds seconds ago, but let's take a look at NG for a moment, because this digraph actually highlights an entirely different problem. So, whenever you're creating digraphs to represent a single sound for your language, you have to make sure that it can't be confused for anything else. In the case of NG, the letters N and G have their own individual pronunciations for languages with voiced systems. So, if N equals na and G equals ga, but NG is nga, how do you write a word like ngangi in Gamilaroi? You can't write it like this because that would be ngangi, and you can't write it like this either because that would be ngangi, which for Australian languages would be a different word. You need to somehow find some way of separating the G from the N, highlighting that it's supposed to be pronounced like ga while still keeping it a part of the word. And the most common way this is done is by placing a full stop between them, as it is done in Gamilaroi, Wiradjuri, Bundjalung, and Darumbal. And I'm just gonna say it, I don't like this solution. I honestly think an apostrophe would have been a better option, since a computer is always going to understand a full stop as punctuation, but it is still functional, so I can't really complain. However, languages with voiceless letters, of course, do not have this problem, because the velar obstruent is always written with a K, meaning ngangi would be written like this if Gamilaroi used a voiceless system. This is why Bining Gunwok and Miriwong also use the letter K as well, although Miriwong still uses G everywhere else, and this is my absolute favourite option out of all of them because you're highlighting that both letters are pronounced individually. But anyway, moving on to the rest of the nasals, once again the other coronal nasals are typically represented with digraphs, and they once again follow the same general spelling rules as the obstruents. The dental nasal for all the languages that have it is written with NH, the palatal nasal is written with NY for all languages except for Bining Gunwok, which uses NJ, and the retroflex nasal is written with RN for most languages except Pinchachara and Yolngu-Matha, which once again use that irritating line below diacritic. Okay, Lingua, is that really a problem? Why don't you just underline the different letters? Did you seriously just call me lingua? Also, yes, it is a problem, and no, that is not a solution. The underline function on your computer doesn't change anything about how the character is encoded, it just changes the format. If you try to copy-paste text in Pinchachara from an ebook or something that uses underlines to write the retroflex consonants, then all the underlines will disappear. It doesn't work. But regardless, it makes absolutely no sense why you would use obscure symbols or diacritics to transcribe your own language when it would work perfectly fine with the appropriate digraphs. You okay there, buddy? I'm fine. Although, on the topic of digraphs, even though most Australian languages transcribe the palatal nasal with NY, it has a similar problem as NG for the velar nasal. For example, in Bining Gunwok, the word gunyaord has the common prefix gun attached to the root word yaord, but it would be incorrect to pronounce it as gunyaord with a palatal nasal, which would be written with NJ, and this is why using J for all the palatal consonants is the best approach in my opinion. I mean, that does depend on whether the palatal nasal anya is distinct from anya, which it might not always be the case, but it's still best to be on the safe side in my opinion. But moving on to the laterals though, out of all the languages in this video, only the alveolar lateral is used by all of them, and it is of course written with the letter L. I am L. And once again, all the other lateral consonants are typically written with digraphs based off of the alveolar consonant. Aranda is the only language here that uses a dental lateral, and it is predictably written as LH, and Warlpiri, Pinchachara, Aranda, and Miriwong have the palatal lateral, all of which are written LY. As I mentioned with the palatal nasal, I would have chosen using LJ to distinguish the digraph from L plus Y, but again, that's only a problem if that's a distinct consonant. And finally, the retroflex lateral in Warlpiri, Aranda, Bining Gunwok, and Miriwong are written with RL, but of course Pinchachara and Yolngu-Matha use the line below diacritic. Bingo! Although, as you'll soon see, in the case of Yolngu-Matha, this pattern does not apply to the transcription of rhotic consonants. Most Australian languages make a distinction between at least two different rhotic consonants, a retroflex glide, a R, and an alveolar flap or trill, a R, and for most languages, including including Yolngu-Matha, the former is written with a single R and the latter with a double R. However, Pinjarra just has to be that guy and use a single R for the alveolar flap because that's not confusing at all, and once again the line below diacritic for the retroflex glide. My god, Pinjarra, just let the diacritic go. Honestly, I'm kinda glad Yolngu-Matha came to its senses right at the very end. The double R for the trilled consonant really does make the most sense. Although, Bundjalung is one of the very rare Australian languages that has only one rhotic consonant, and it is usually pronounced as a flap, da, but it is only written with a single R because there's nothing else it could possibly be confused for. And finally, the labiovelar and palatal semivowels, which all the languages have, are always written with W and Y respectively, which makes total sense, like no complaints from me. Before I move on to the vowels, however, while I have gone over all of the common consonants that exist across all Australian languages, there are still some languages that have a few extra sounds. Biningunwok and Yolngu-Matha also have a consonant called a glottal stop, which sounds like a. To most English speakers listening, this consonant probably doesn't sound like anything, but it is an actual sound, and a lot of languages in the northern parts of Australia use it. In fact, I'm slightly annoyed at myself for not bringing this consonant up earlier in the phonology video, but whatever. In Biningunwok, the glottal stop is represented with the letter H, which it can get away with because it doesn't have any dental consonants. But for Yolngu-Matha, the glottal stop is represented with an apostrophe, which is the more common transcription as far as I'm aware. There is also that retroflex tap consonant I mentioned in the phonology video that exists in Warlpiri, but it's come to my attention that this isn't actually a distinct consonant phoneme by itself. It is actually a sound that is formed when the regular glide and tap rhotics occur next to each other in that order, but since that would result in a very confusing triple R in the writing system, it is instead written with the digraph RD. And now I'm really annoyed at myself for giving this sound its own box in the phonology video when it isn't actually a distinct consonant and it isn't even a very common sound. I mean, the glottal stop occurs way more often than it does. In fact, you know what? There you go, there's a revised version of the consonant chart for Australian languages. So much better. Darumbal, on the other hand, does have a distinct third rhotic, which I'm not exactly sure how to classify, but I think it's supposed to be a fortis alveolar trill? Well, either way, it's written as RH, and I think it's pronounced as RH. But anyway, I think that's all of the consonants done, which means we can finally move on to the last group of phonemes, the vowels. Out of all the languages in this video, most of them have three distinct vowels: the low central vowel A, the high front vowel E, and the high back vowel U. Gamilaroi, Wiradjuri, Warlpiri, Pinjarra, Yolngu-Matha, and Darumbal all abide by the three vowel system, and they are each written with the letters A, I, and U respectively. The only language on here that does not have all of these vowels is Aranda, which only phonemically distinguishes between the low central vowel A and a mid-central vowel written with the letter E. The vowels E and U do sometimes occur in Aranda, but they only pop up very rarely, and they're mostly understood as vocalic variants of the semivowels y and w. Other languages have more than three distinct vowel phonemes. Miriwung uses the three vowel system plus the mid-central and Bundjalung has an extra mid-front vowel, both of which are written with the letter E in their respective languages, but they represent different sounds. Also, for some reason, Miriwung decides to use a double O for the high back vowel U, and I just, why? I literally don't understand why you would do that. Like, seriously, what's wrong with the letter U? Are you trying to stand out or something, Miriwung? And also, why do you write the letter O twice if it doesn't occur anywhere else? Why don't you just use a single O once to represent one sound? Miriwung's writing system is a real quirky bench, isn't it? And finally, Biningunwok is the only language here with a 5-vowel system, with the mid-vowels E and O written with E and O respectively. But there are also a couple of languages that make a distinction between short and long vowels, and there are a couple of different ways these languages do it. Typically, the long vowels are just written with double letters, as is the case in Gamilaroi, Wiradjuri, Warlpiri, and Pinjarra, and this to me makes the most sense. If the vowel is the same and it just lasts for slightly longer, just write the vowel twice. Easy breezy. However, in the case of Bundjalung, which also has long vowels, the letter H is used to represent them instead, and once again the language can get away with using H like this as it doesn't have any dental consonants. And I mean, the end result doesn't look that bad either. Using H to represent long vowels, however, isn't the most unusual way I've seen them transcribed though. That prize would have to go to how Yolngu-Matha writes its long vowels. Each of the long vowels in Yolngu-Matha are given their own separate letters, with long E and long U being written with the letters E and O respectively, and long A being written with an A umlaut. Again, just like I said about Miriwong's double O, why? Why do you do this, Yolngu-Matha? What are you just trying to be as extra as possible? Is that it? I don't fucking know. And wow, this video has become a lot longer than I thought it was going to be. I hope that this video did its job in explaining how Australian languages generally represent their individual phonologies, otherwise I just wasted your time for like 15 minutes. If you were to ask me which writing system out of these languages I like the most, it would definitely have to be Biningunwok. Voiced obstruents plus K, NG for the velar nasal, consistency in its coronal symmetry, single R for the glide rhotic, double R for the trilled rhotic, no obscure letters or diacritics, making it easy to type. Honestly, it just does everything right. A close second would probably be a tie between Aranda and Warlpiri, although the voiceless letters for obstruents throw me off sometimes as I want to pronounce them slightly harder than they actually sound. But anyway, I hope all of you enjoyed this video, and if you're thinking of creating a writing system for your own language, I hope all of this information was helpful for you in some way. Of course, if you did enjoy this video, don't forget to give it a like and share it online and leave nice comments in the comments section. If you want to see videos as soon as they're publicly available, I would highly recommend subscribing and turning on them notifications. And also, I'll let you in on a little secret, if you want to see my videos a whole week earlier than everyone else, as well as all sorts of bonus content, be sure to support me on Patreon as well. Thank you all for listening, and we'll speak again next time.